Welcome to the first Leland Library Seminar of the 2026 season. My name is Chelsea. I am a librarian here at the Leland Township Public Library. Thank you all for joining us today. I just have a few quick things to get through before we hand it off. Our AC is trying to keep up, so if you get uncomfortable, please know that it's working as hard as it can. There's really nothing I can do, unfortunately. The bathrooms that we have are down the hall to the right. We also have one new bathroom on the other side of our new children's room in the library. If you would please silence your cell phones at this time, I would greatly appreciate that. This is a partnership between the library and the International Affairs Forum, which is thrilling for us on a number of fronts, but also primarily because we get to live stream this, and we don't normally have the capability to do that, which means more people can see it, more people can benefit. And I'm a librarian, I'm passionate about libraries, and the best way to support libraries is by using them. So I appreciate y'all being here. And I'll turn it over to you, Alex.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us, and thanks to Dr. Michelmore for the insights that she's going to provide. And thank you very much, Chelsea and Mark and the team here at Leland Public Library for partnering with the International Affairs Forum. It's a great pleasure to be able to utilize this platform in various places around Northern Michigan and help spread global affairs education for our community and make it relevant to all of us here locally in Northern Michigan. So I'm very pleased to be here today with you all, and also we'll be back July 14th with Dr. Laura Robson talking about refugees and statelessness. And I had an idea, which is the old art building, which is also a satellite partner of the International Affairs Forum. You can watch these live streams on a monthly basis at the old art building during the year from September to June. But next July 14th, after that, there's a concert with, I think it's Warren and Flick at 7-ish, and that's some great music. So we could pair this afternoon at 4 o'clock here at Leland Public Library and 7-ish at the old art building for Warren and Flick.
And tonight, actually, at the OAB is Music on the Lawn. So they've got a Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young cover band. Did you have a question?
So I just want to clarify, because in the newspaper when these things were announced, it said Tuesday the 14th, and
Correct.
so it's Tuesday the 12th, not Thursday the 14th for the next one?
It is the 14th, it's a Tuesday, I believe.
It's a Tuesday,
Yeah.
July 14th.
Yeah.
I may have misspoken just now.
No, it's a Tuesday.
So,
Are you all set?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you.
I won't keep you too much longer. This is maybe one of our most requested guests we've ever had speak or present.
Only
at the
by my
library.
fan club up
She
here.
has a fan club. I get so many requests. Please bring her back. So here she is. Dr. Chris Michelmore. She's the former chair of the Department of History at Chatham University. She has a BA from Smith and a Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania. And she's here to talk to us about the connected wars in the Middle East. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm not entirely in charge of this technology. She is, so I hope it all works. I'm a little like a bad penny, as far as I can tell. I turn up here when there's a war in the Middle East. So 2 years ago, I talked about the Gaza War. Last summer, I talked about the June War. And today, I'm going to talk about the February War, the U.S.-Iran War, or the occasionally called the Dire Straits War. It has a lot of names. These are not separate wars, although they are often treated as if they were. I think they're connected, at least initially, by Palestine. So we're going to start there very briefly and look at the Palestinian question. So the Palestinian question has bedeviled the Middle East and the world since at least 1948. I think it remains unresolved 75 years after it began because of these 4 interlocking issues that you see on the slide. So first, 2 peoples claim the same land as their homeland. Both of their claims have legitimacy. They both have historical depth. Neither accepts the claims of the other. And this is the core issue. And you'll hear me say it a couple more times over the next 45 minutes or so. Every framework that's tried to address this core dilemma has failed. So the first one, I've already screwed up the technology.
No, let's see if we can do it just right here. Go ahead and try that.
How's that? Better? I feel a little screechy. Okay. So the first framework that tried to solve this was the UN Partition Plan of 1947, and you see that on the middle map. Essentially, the UN divided Palestine into two equal parts, one for Palestinians, one for Israelis. That was rejected, and it led to war. In the early 90s, there was great hope produced by the two-state solution framework, which was essentially the repartition of Palestine. And you see a kind of representation of the two-state solution on the map on the right. Essentially, Israel would give back to the Palestinians the Gaza and the West Bank, which they had occupied since 1967, and the Palestinians would recognize Israel and make peace. That framework collapsed in the mid-2000s. And since then, there hasn't really been another framework. However, and it's important to note, the two-state solution remains the sort of go-to solution for the international community, for the United States, for the UN, though not necessarily for either Palestinians or Israelis. The third is that this conflict involves real power asymmetry. Israel is a state. It's been a state since 1948. It has all the powers and prerogatives of a state. Palestinians are stateless. They're politically fragmented. They are under occupation. There's no real pressure on the powerful to make concessions, and there's no real power on the part of the powerless to make them do so. And the last one is this conflict has lasted for 75 years. So each cycle of violence and repression and violence reaffirms the worst fears of each side. Into the impasse created by the failure of the two-state solution framework stepped Benjamin Netanyahu. And he had a new idea. His new strategy had real simplistic elegance. Don't try and solve the Palestinian problem. If you tried to solve it, that would create pressure for a two-state solution. And he was adamantly opposed to a two-state solution, as are perhaps the majority of Israelis today. Don't try and solve it, bypass it. Bypass it through containment. And his containment strategy had sort of three pillars. The first one was settlement. In the West Bank, speed up Israeli settlement expansion so as to make a Palestinian state sort of physically impossible. And you can see sort of on that map what happens in the West Bank. So in the West Bank, these light green areas are either military zones, Israeli military zones, or settlements. Palestinians live in the blue areas, and the Palestinian Authority has some control over them. If you tried to draw borders without moving populations, you would be unable to make a contiguous Palestinian state. Secondly, the second pillar was division. Keep the Palestinians divided. The Palestinian Authority administers the West Bank. It is weak, corrupt, repressive, autocratic, but it supports a two-state solution. Hamas controlled Gaza. It supports the violent destruction of Israel. So it's dangerous, but for Netanyahu's purposes, it was useful. The crucial calculation was keep Hamas caged in Gaza with walls, with blockade, with occasional sort of military assaults that would roll back their military capabilities, what is called mowing the grass. But don't destroy Hamas. Destroying it might create pressure for negotiations. Negotiations would create pressure for a two-state solution. So division made a two-state solution increasingly diplomatically impossible. And third, and this is really Netanyahu's genius, I think, and the keystone of his solution. The 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which had sort of created the regional framework for peace since then, said solve the Palestinian problem first, create a Palestinian state or a process toward Palestinian sovereignty, and normalization, acceptance into the region would follow for Israel. Netanyahu convinced the Gulf states, and eventually Washington, that a nuclear-armed Iran, not Palestine, was the cause of instability and violence. So shared security concerns should override Arab solidarity. You should normalize first with Israel, and Palestine could wait. In 2020, with considerable incentives from the Trump administration, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates signed the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations with Israel. By 2023, Saudi Arabia seemed close to joining the Accords, again with a considerable amount of incentives provided by the Biden administration. Benjamin Netanyahu gave a speech at the United Nations in September of 2023, and he held up these maps that you see here on the slide. This one shows a corridor of cooperation from Europe through Israel, the Arab states, to Asia, a kind of American-sponsored Belt and Road Chinese alternative. You'll notice on the top map that Palestine or the West Bank and Gaza don't appear. There is only a solid blue Israel. And the opposite of the blessings of cooperation is the curse of Iran. A new regional order waited in the wings. Israel integrated into the Middle East, Palestinians politically invisible, Iran isolated by a regional order built against it, and the US, the main outside power, but with less burdens, with a reduced burden for containing Iran. So maybe finally we could actually pivot to Asia, which we've been trying to do since the Clinton administration. Not surprisingly, Iran opposed this regional vision. Since 1979, since its establishment, Iran has seen itself as the victim of American and Israeli power, two much more powerful states cooperating together to shape and constrain its future. Iran is Persian and Shia Arab, so it is the minority sect of Islam. It is surrounded by Sunni Arab states with a long history of antagonism between each other. And those states, as you can see on this map on the right, host an inordinate number of American bases. The number of bases surrounding Iran in the Gulf is really incredible. Iran desired to become a regional power, to resist America and Israeli plans and take its place as the regional leader. Iranian antipathy is reciprocated by the United States. For Iran, the US is the great Satan, or in Khomeini's words, the wounded snake in the garden. The Iranians really can't forgive us for the 1953 coup that put the Shah back in power and kept him there for 20-plus miserable years. In Trump's words, Iran is the evil empire of crazy bastards. We can't forgive Iran for the 1979 hostage crisis. And Iran and Israel have long considered each other to be both rivals for regional power and leadership, and potentially existential threats. So this isn't just policy disagreement, right? This is really deep ideological and psychological hostility. So Iran's response to its regional vulnerability, to its isolation, was to build the axis of resistance as both a shield against US-Israeli aggression and a sword of Iranian regional power. And on the list that you can see there of the members of the axis of resistance, which I suspect if you read the newspapers you are entirely tired of learning about, of those, Hezbollah is the big gun. It's the biggest, it's the best armed, it's the best trained, and it shares a border with Israel. It is also the most complex. So Hezbollah is at one and the same time an anti-Israeli, pro-Palestinian resistance movement that emerged in the 1980s in Lebanon as a response to the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon from 1982 until 2000. It is also the political representative of the Shia community in Lebanon. And Shia, the Lebanese political and social system is a sectarian one. So power and authority and the good things of society are determined by what sect you belong to. And it is also an Iranian proxy. And this sort of tripartite identity shapes what Hezbollah does in any given instance. Except for Hamas, the Axis powers, the Axis elements are all Shia groups. And the bedrock of support for those groups comes from Shia Muslims who feel like they're underrepresented and underserved and sometimes oppressed in the Sunni countries that they live in. Those countries are run by Sunni leaders, Sunni majorities. So the idea of setting up armed Shia groups in Sunni states risked increasing sectarian animosity and deepening Iranian isolation, not assuaging it. And Iran's solution to that was to make Palestine central to its regional strategy. And this worked, I think, on two levels. So Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder and first supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, reframed Shia Islam from a kind of sectarian identity into a kind of liberation theology. In a world organized by haves and have-nots, oppressed and oppressors, Iran stood on the side of the oppressed have-nots. So supporting Palestine, which had been a kind of Arab duty, became a Muslim duty. And I think this is genuine conviction. I think it is embedded throughout the regime. But it is also really good strategy. Palestine resonates across Muslim communities, Shia and Sunni, Arab and non-Arab, regional and international. It positions Israel and the United States as common enemies of all Muslims. So it gives Shia and Sunni, Persians and Arabs, something in common. And it gives Shia groups and Iran itself legitimacy and popular support, which it otherwise wouldn't have, I think, in the Middle East. So it's very hard in the Middle East to attack groups that are actively fighting Israel. It's very hard to demand that they disarm if they're seen to be resisting occupation, fighting Israeli aggression. So, by 2023, you've got two reasonably stable blocs confronting each other in the Middle East. And both regional blocs are in some ways organized around Palestine, although in very different, opposite ways. So Netanyahu's strategy is to make Palestine irrelevant to the regional order through containment and normalization in order to obtain security for Israel and to avoid a two-state solution. Iran's strategy is to make Palestine central to the regional order through the axis of resistance in order to gain regional legitimacy and influence. And October 7th, and the wars that it ignited in the Middle East, was the violent collision of those two strategic visions. And the regional order built around them begins to shift. So on October 7th, 2023, as you all know, I'm sure, Hamas fighters broke out of Gaza. They killed 1,200 Israelis, and they took 251 hostages back into the tunnels of Gaza. Hamas leaders are accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The aim of Hamas's attack was, in fact, to provoke a violent, overwhelming Israeli assault. This was an incredibly cynical strategy. The whole idea was to make sure that Palestinian suffering in Gaza would recenter the Palestinian question. It would scuttle Saudi Arabian normalization, and it would at best draw in other elements of the axis of resistance to help Hamas fight Israel. Hamas was right. Israel launched a devastating air and land assault. Israel's conduct of the war in Gaza has earned it charges of war crimes, of crimes against humanity, and genocide. Public sympathy and support for Israel in Europe and the United States, which was very strong at the beginning of the Gaza war, has plummeted since. But then Hamas expected a return to containment. So a quick, brutal assault by Israel would gain them world sympathy, Hamas world sympathy, but then Israel would go back to containment. And in this, of course, Hamas was catastrophically wrong. Israel developed a new strategic doctrine. Don't contain threats. Don't manage threats. Eliminate them with devastating military force. That force destroyed Gaza, but it probably hasn't yet destroyed Hamas. And you will hear this a couple more times today. In general, these conflicts that we're watching are military successes and in most ways political failures. So you see a chronology here of the conflicts that Gaza started. So Gaza started it. The conflict spread because of the Palestine link. Hezbollah fired rockets into northern Israel on October the 8th in solidarity with Hamas. So by the second day of the war in Gaza, this had already become a regional conflict. The two, Hezbollah and Israel, then exchanged strikes for almost a year. But by September of 2024, Israel had had it. And they launched heavy bombardment and a land invasion, determined to push Hezbollah north of the Litani River. So this is the Litani River right here, and Israeli troops have been moving north in an attempt to push Hezbollah out of the border area with Israel. That's about 20 miles into Lebanon. The United States forced a ceasefire on a fairly reluctant Israel in November of 2024. Both sides broke the ceasefire routinely, but it did moderate the violence for almost a year. Mostly because of what was going on between Hezbollah and Israel, Iran and Israel then exchanged direct strikes in April and October. And this was a second escalation. This ended the era of proxy conflicts. It normalizes direct conflict between the two most powerful militaries in the Middle East. And it significantly degraded Iranian air defenses. That led to the much larger 12-day June War in 2025. At the very end, again in a significant escalation, the United States gets involved for the first time. American bunker buster bombs targeted Iran's deeply buried nuclear facilities. This is not a US war. This is an Israeli-Iran war in which the United States flies in on the 9th day. We drop 14 bombs and shoot off a few tomahawks, and then we go home. And we enforce a ceasefire on both sides, on Israel mostly. Nationwide protests erupted after the June War in Iran. Iran's economy collapsed, and so we say widespread protests in Iran, which protest the economy, but also for the first time begin to call for the fall of the Islamic Republic. And that leads us to the February War. And if I could find my clicker with all my other stuff, that would be good. Here we go. And this is a fourth and huge escalation. So the idea of a joint attack from the reporting that's been done appears to have come from Benjamin Netanyahu. At the end of the 12-day June War, Israel was the unchallenged military hegemon in the Middle East. But its enemies were degraded, not defeated. And Israel was no closer to the durable peace that Netanyahu had promised Israelis after the October 7th attacks. And elections are coming in the fall. So Netanyahu basically needed a way out of the endless wars of the cycle of containment. Iran was weaker than it had ever been before. It was unprotected by its proxies who had been discombobulated by previous Israeli attacks. It had no or almost no air defenses. Its economy was in free fall, and domestic protests were shaking the regime. So the idea really was that a big enough push and a big enough external shock would destroy the Islamic regime. So the idea was to overwhelm Iran, kill Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, and as many other leaders as you could find. Use Israeli intelligence networks to trigger another popular protest movement, mobilize unhappy Kurds in the north to put more internal pressure on the regime, And this tsunami would sweep away the regime. And that would defund the proxies. It would foreclose the nuclear program. It would open, again, the path to normalization with Saudi Arabia, which would then reorder the region. And critically, I think, particularly for the United States, the shock and awe of the initial attack would be so overwhelming that the regime would not have the focus or the will or the weapons to respond, to retaliate. So it would be quick, it would be easy, it would be a game changer. But only the United States had the size, military power to deliver the kind of military shock that would make regime change even possible. So Netanyahu pitched his plan to President Trump. As far as we can tell from the reporting, the president's advisors raised objections, but not for very long and not very strenuously. No allies, not in Europe, not in Asia, not in the region, were consulted. President Trump wrongly associated his victory in Venezuela with the possible victory in Iran. And the president had been hostile to Iran since 1979. So he would be the president to finally settle the score with the Islamic regime for the humiliation of 1979. From all accounts, the decision to go to war was made virtually alone. Militarily, US and Israeli strikes were a military success. Khamenei and the other top officials were killed on the first day. One of the reasons that we went to war on February 28th was because the Israeli intelligence services knew where Khamenei was. He was in his bunker with the rest of his family. Over 40 days of near constant bombardment, Allied forces hit military installations, missile sites, nuclear facilities, energy infrastructure, and almost inevitably civilian sites. If you look at this map here on the left-hand side, in turquoise are Israeli and American strikes. And what I just want you to notice here is how widespread these strikes were all over Iran and how dense they were. But the regime did not collapse. Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, was chosen supreme leader, buttressed largely by figures from the Revolutionary Guard. You see pictures of banners like this all over the internet. As soon as they opened up the internet, people took pictures of billboards and banners and all over Iran. I think the intent of this banner is pretty clear. You've got the three leaders. There is order, there is continuity, there is leadership. On the banner is a verse from the Quran, which you see the translation here on the slide, help from God and victory is near. This is a verse that Muslims, when they're facing various troubles in their lives, recite. And it basically means, if I believe in God and I do what I'm supposed to do, God will help me get through whatever this is. But it has become a kind of anthem of resistance, both in Iran and for Hezbollah. Iran retaliated against Israel, but now for the first time, it launched missiles and drones at its neighbors, seriously damaging US military bases, Gulf energy infrastructure, commercial areas, and punctured the security of the Gulf. Gulf states had tried very hard in the last decade to create a kind of bubble of security and peace in the Gulf. separated from the rest of the volatile Middle East as a kind of prerequisite for their very ambitious economic diversification plans. And that was punctured. And you can see on this map, the yellow strikes are Iranian strikes on the Gulf and Israel. They were organized, they were deliberate, they knew what they were going to attack, and they were, in fact, militarily effective. And then on the second day of the war, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, which we now all know, through which we now all know flows 20% of the world's oil and gas, and about a third of the components for fertilizers, and also helium, which is used in things like MRI machines. And a global economic crisis, rising prices, shortages, inflation, and then a food crisis, a looming food crisis followed. Throughout March, President Trump declared victory. Unfortunately, those declarations kept being contradicted by events on the ground. On April 7th, in the morning, he threatened civilizational annihilation if Iran didn't do what he said. That evening, he unilaterally declared a ceasefire. And that ceasefire held barely, and eventually produced the Memorandum of Understanding of June the 17th. And that memorandum is hailed by a sort of framework for peace between the United States and Iran. The memorandum has two phases, one immediate, one put off to negotiations. In the immediate category, there were two linked actions. Iran would open the Strait of Hormuz, allowing oil to flow out of it, and in response, the United States would end the sanctions on Iranian oil. Iran could freely export its oil and sell it at market prices, which it hasn't been able to do for at least a decade. And both countries, Iran and the United States, agreed that Israel and Hezbollah would stop fighting, that there would be a ceasefire in Lebanon, and Israel would withdraw. In the put-off category is Iran's nuclear program. And again, limits to that program that really aren't specified at all in the memorandum, limits to that program are linked to a further reduction of US sanctions and significant financial relief to Iran. The content and the sequencing of the memorandum tells you something, I think, about the power relationship right now between the United States and Iran, and eventually hints at the shape of the peace if we get there. So first, the sequencing. The sequencing reflects Iran's advantages. The Trump administration is desperate to get out of this war, and it is visibly desperate to get out of the war. And the Strait of Hormuz gives Iran enormous leverage. You see billboards here in Tehran. I hope you can make them out. This one just says the Straits belongs to Iran. But this one, in the shape of the Strait, catches American air power. The Strait is Iran's main defense against more attacks from the United States. And my favorite here, President Trump's lips are sewn shut by the Strait of Hormuz. And interestingly, the taglines on this billboard are both English and Persian. So it's clearly both for domestic consumption and for international consumption. Iran has been really good at propaganda. So I don't know if any of you have seen the Lego memes on the internet. If you haven't, you should go look at them. They basically ridicule America and particularly President Trump, and they have millions of hits. They are very popular across the world. And in English, it says, at the breaking point. So it presumably means the United States is going to break before we are, right? In terms of suffering, we can take way more suffering than can the Americans. But in Persian, it says, we are ready. Again, a sort of, the regime goes on, resistance goes on. We're here. We're not collapsing. We're not going anywhere. And you can see the sequencing and power of these two things in what the memorandum says. So first of all, the memorandum puts off to some future negotiations the dealing with the existential threat that justified the war to begin with, that is Iran's nuclear program. But Iran gets an immediate economic benefit of significant proportions. It can sell its oil again. So we have expended a lot of leverage in order to go back to the pre-war situation. We've expended a lot of leverage to get rid of a problem we didn't have when we went to war, which was the straits being closed. Secondly, clearly the United States prioritized peace with Iran over Israeli security and Israeli desires. And thirdly, conspicuous by its absence, there is no mention of drones or missiles or proxies. Those are not going to be negotiated, presumably. Nukes, a nuclear-armed Iran, might be an existential threat to Israel and the regime, and the region. But missiles and drones and proxies are the immediate operational threat. And we're not going to even discuss those, presumably. And secondly, if you look at sort of the power differential and then the content of the memorandum, both suggest that a final agreement, if we get to one, is going to look pretty much like the 2015 Obama deal. So Iran has shown itself willing to make concessions on nuclear weapons. So it's likely to be able to, it will be willing to discuss stockpiles of highly enriched uranium. It's likely to be willing to discuss the levels of ongoing enrichment. It will probably allow international inspections, but it won't concede enrichment. It said that before the war, it said it after the war. And they will want quicker sanction relief and quicker financial relief. So if I have this right, Iran gets a lot out of this memorandum. We don't get very much, and Israel and the region gets nothing. Now, what happens if we can't agree is anybody's guess. The president continues to threaten to return to bombing. But for a whole variety of reasons, that threat rings fairly hollow. If I had to bet, I'd bet that the ceasefire holds, sorta. Because I don't think either state, either the United States or Iran, wants to go back to war, full-scale war. It is too economically and politically expensive. But I would also bet we don't get much of an agreement anytime soon, and certainly not within the 60 days. So we're likely to see kind of endless extensions of the negotiations in what is a kind of informal stalemate of the issue. So we may get out of the war, and we may get out of actively fighting the war. But a US-Iran deal does not bring peace to the Middle East. In fact, it probably makes it worse. And I've got 3 reasons here. First is Palestine. Israel's military has clearly degraded the Axis. For a country surrounded by enemies, that is not nothing. Hamas is probably no threat anytime soon to Israel. But the core problem that started this escalating cycle of conflict is purposefully not addressed. So 7.5 million Israeli Jews confront 7.5 million Palestinians in a land that both of them claim and is about the size of the county of Los Angeles. That hasn't gone away. And bypassing it will not produce a durable, legitimate regional order. And if the last 2.5 years has proved anything, it's proved that the Palestine problem can't be contained to Israel-Palestine. So ongoing Palestinian issues will block further normalization. It will give traction to anti-status quo forces like Iran. As long as there is no political horizon, as long as Israel occupies territory in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, as long as there's no future that looks any better than the present, groups like Hezbollah and Hamas will continue to exist. They will continue to threaten Israel, and Iran will be there to help them. Because secondly, there has been, I think, a regional shift. For how long, I don't know. Through the 12-day war, Iran and the Axis grew weaker. The United States and Israel grew stronger. But the February war, the US-Iran war, has reinvigorated the axis of resistance. So Iran emerges militarily weakened, but strategically emboldened. It is reasonably coherent, self-confident, harder line than before, more willing to take risk, more militaristic, and just as repressive. It has more leverage, more regional influence than before the February war. How long that leverage lasts is a question. If Iran holds out too long or tries to control the strait too much, it may win the war and lose the peace, because already people are trying to find a way around the Strait of Hormuz. And third, and conversely, US credibility is, I think, in tatters. American forces were tactically brilliant, but the war, and even more the peace, has been a strategic disaster. We failed to achieve any of our stated goals. And in the process of losing the war, we damaged our relations with both sets of allies in the Middle East. So we dragged the Gulf states into a war they opposed, a war that damaged their economies. We didn't protect them, which was the only reason they had US bases there to begin with. And then we negotiated an exit strategy that leaves them vulnerable to a resurgent Iran. We went to war with Israel, but we negotiated without Israel. Trump ridiculed Benjamin Netanyahu. He signed a deal that gave Israel almost nothing. He demanded that Israel withdraw from southern Lebanon. Netanyahu repudiated the memorandum, and he has conspicuously ignored the demand that he withdraw from Lebanon. So we can't win, we betray our allies, and then we can't enforce an agreement we just signed. That's a catastrophic trifecta of unreliability, particularly for a great power that continues to say that it is the regional leader in the Middle East. So I started today by saying there are two regional blocs competing in the Middle East. Both were built around Palestine. The system operated under a U.S. umbrella of support and threat, protection for allies, deterrent threat for enemies. What we're watching is two incompatible strategies for managing an unresolved problem collide with enough force to shatter the regional architecture. And at the same time, the U.S. umbrella is smaller and less sturdy as a result of an ill-conceived and appallingly managed war. What replaces this structure is unclear. But this much at least seems certain to me, that the Palestinian core problem remains, even though almost no one is talking about it. It has been totally sort of subsumed in the wider war. Iranian resistance and the threat it poses to Israel and the Gulf remains. Israel, I think, will not support a status quo stalemate. It's simply too dangerous from their perspective. The U.S. is stuck. We are not pivoting to Asia anytime soon. And we will have less influence in the region that we're stuck in. And the region itself will remain unstable, volatile, and violent. I very much hope that I will not be back next year to talk about a fourth war, but I wouldn't bet on it. So if you have questions, I'll be happy to take them. In the back.
Can you go back to your last slide?
Sure. Before the questioning dude?
Yes. So the third bullet, Israel will not support the status quo stalemate.
Yes, sir.
What do you think they're going to do?
I think they're going to continue to fight with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the big question is, will Iran then think of that as being, the memorandum says they'll stop fighting. If fighting goes on, is that a reason not to negotiate? Or will they kind of wink and blink? And we'll go on, and there will be breaks in the ceasefire, but we'll go on negotiating.
So Israel has ground troops, but they don't bomb Beirut. We wink, and if they bomb Beirut, it's over.
Maybe, yes, exactly. And in some sense, it's how visible is the conflict. Yes, yeah.
Given what you know of all of the relationships between the State Department and the military, why do you think the military did not stand up more strongly to Trump and tell him this was a disaster?
The question, I'm supposed to say what the questions were, Alex? Yeah. Sorry, I forgot. The question is, why didn't the U.S. military tell the president this was a terrible idea? I think in many ways Dan Kane did. The Joint Chief of Staff's head did. He gave him all sorts of problems with this idea. But what he didn't say, apparently, was, don't do it, Mr. President. But that's, in some ways, not what he sees as his role. Right? I think the problem is less that the military didn't say something, but that we don't really have a process for making foreign policy. This is a one-man band. There's no process of consultation. We didn't consult allies who were going to clearly be affected by the war. Yeah.
How much of the Israel position is Netanyahu's political situation versus what the people of Israel want?
Right. How much of Netanyahu's policy is designed to improve his own personal problems and how much reflects Israeli security or Israeli popular needs? The war against Iran and Hezbollah is very popular in Israel. So at about 93%. It's a very popular war. This is a country that feels existentially threatened. And for the last 2.5 years plus, 60,000 Israelis in the north have been displaced from their homes. So it's a terrible political problem too. But it's pretty clear that conflict and war and upheaval keeps Netanyahu in power, partly because the extremists in his coalition that want war to continue hold the balance of power. And he doesn't want to lose power. He's in his sixth year of a corruption trial. And the more he can postpone it, the better for him. But I do think that the wars are publicly supported. Less so Hamas, less so Gaza, which has become a real grind. But the other two air campaigns are popular. Yeah.
Has it, in your opinion, has it ever been the case that going back to 1947 or earlier, have we ever understood the relationship in the Islamic religions and the interrelationships and the bare history as to what's been going on and how much does that influence? Has our administrations ever taken the time?
Yes,
All parties.
I think so, yes. I mean, the 2015 Obama agreement with Iran has been criticized on all sorts of levels, and it wasn't perfect. But the Obama administration, they understood who they were dealing with. They'd spent a lot of time studying Iran and studying Iran's red lines. This is what we're going to get, and if we ask for more, we're not going to get something. So let's figure out what is our biggest problem with Iran and solve it, and maybe then we can deal with some of the rest of them. So they picked the nuclear problem. That's not the region's problem in some sense, but it's ours. And they were successful, but it took them 2+ years, right? And the Iranians are very good bargainers, and they've spent an inordinate amount of time studying us. So they know where our red lines are. Yes, Stephen.
Chris, as I understand it, closing the Strait of Hormuz is not an issue. It doesn't really affect Israel.
No, it gets most of it. The question is, I keep forgetting. The question is, if closing the Strait of Hormuz doesn't really affect Israel. No, it gets most of its gas from the...
Where I'm going with that then is, if Israel's unhappy with the current state of affairs, can't they simply create more trouble in Lebanon and pull us back in?
Yes. I mean, you see just how weak a position we wound up in. Israel can stop the negotiations by attacking Hezbollah. But if Iran wants to stop them, they can get Hezbollah to attack Israel, and that stops the negotiations too. And we're stuck, right? And it's going to be, you basically, I think, both sides have to say, this is the minimum we're going to get. So let's get the best nuclear deal we can get with Iran and get out. And Iran needs to say, let's not push too hard on the straits, on controlling the straits. Because we need a deal. We need to get out. We have serious, serious economic problems, not to mention all of the environmental problems they haven't dealt with all those years. Yeah.
I think the next significant regime change may be ours. I'm assuming that at some point we'll have a different administration. And what would be the steps to taking the shadow out of this picture? And what might the next administration do? What kind of steps could they take to restore some kind of reasonable order? Reasonable regional order? It isn't clear to me that we are going to have the influence to do that. That's first point. Second point, I think, is if you began to work on a regional order that was more inclusive, you might get farther. So you can't have a regional order. Dividing the region into two hostile blocks hasn't worked very well for anybody. And so if you began, the Gulf countries are beginning to try and think about a regional order that is both close to the United States, but also with some sort of some agreement with Iran that prevents conflict. But the Gulf is divided itself over whether Iran is the biggest threat or Israel is the biggest threat. And so I think it will take several years. And maybe the best we could do is just leave them alone and let them figure something out. That would be the best. My notion, if I were the president, would be to let Iran fall of its own accord. This is a very, very disliked regime. But a disliked regime that's being bombed by outsiders tends to get more credibility. And so I would let them deal with their own problems for a while. Israel's going to be a bigger problem because we have more influence there. But there's a regime change coming there too, I think. Yeah.
Yes, in terms of more inclusion in that region, Rahm Emanuel has his way of saying, you're never going to get a two-state solution. What you need is a 23-state solution, which means everybody in the region recognizes Israel, and for that, you get the compromise in Israel to get there. Is that?
Well, that's the whole point of Netanyahu's idea, right? But he wanted to avoid a two-state solution,
Yeah,
exactly. Right. So you could maybe, if you flipped the 202 framework, normalization, integration, and then a solution. But I actually don't think that there's enough trust in the region to make that work. I think you'd almost, the problem with most of these agreements is they've been sequential. Palestinians have to do X, Israel will do Y. And that hasn't worked, partly because Palestinians can't do or won't do what they're supposed to do, and then Israel doesn't do what it's supposed to do either. So they'd almost have to be simultaneous. And that would be a UN issue, I think, or a regional issue. It would probably have to start with the rebuilding of Gaza and an end to the annexationist talk about the West Bank.
Chris, it seems to me, thinking about it, that if I were currently president, I'd spend the news, and I would try to make as much money as I could before I voted.
Well, yeah, not a bad idea. And we have a good sort of a model for it. Okay, yes.
So do we have any negotiators currently who know anything about anything except real estate?
No. I think that is one of the big problems, and we will see it going forward in negotiations. We have two realtors and a vice president who is a smart man, is trying, I think, to get us out of this war, but knows very little about Iran and knows almost nothing about nuclear issues. And you've got to know what you're talking about. Real estate dealers, real estate men are good at negotiating real estate because they actually know about real estate. They probably aren't so good about dealing with Iran because they really don't know anything about Iran. And there are people in the State Department, even now, who do, but they're not being generally consulted. Yeah, a couple more questions, and then we really need to go home.
The Straits of Hormuz, and that means such a critical pinch point right now. It seemed like from an economic standpoint, from a geographic standpoint, the result now is obvious. Was this a missed issue, or was it a calculated risk?
That is, that they would close it?
Respond with
right. The whole idea, I think, was that the shock and awe would be so great that they couldn't resist. They wouldn't retaliate. They would just collapse. So no one really anticipated in either Israel or the United States, so far as I can tell, that they would close it. Now, Iran had said, faced with an existential threat, we will close the Straits of Hormuz, and we will fire on those Gulf states that have U.S. bases. We just actually didn't believe them.
Well, geography's been removed from pretty much everybody's curriculum anymore. And you just wonder, if there really is sincerely a lack of appreciation of the geography, something as basic as the geography of the area and the... Again, I think if you look, the U.S. military has all sorts of plans for exactly what to do. Where is the Strait? What does the geography look like? How could we stop them from closing it? But they weren't consulted, and those pieces were not in place when we went to war. or the economists either follow the money.
Yes, right, exactly. Okay, yes?
Could you tell us what's left of the Gaza? Physically, what's left?
Almost nothing. About somewhere between 80 and 90% of its structures are damaged beyond repair. There are billions of tons of cement, and nobody knows what to do with them. It is a sort of, it's a nightmare to try and figure out how to rehabilitate. Israel now occupies about 70% of Gaza, and the Palestinians are not allowed in that 70%, so they are all confined to a 30% coastal enclave in which there are really no buildings. They're in tents. This is a displacement camp, and it's entirely dependent on international aid. Most of the agricultural land is under occupation. They don't have food, they don't have medicine, they don't have adequate water. They can't leave. It's a nightmare, and you're not going to get very far with any kind of solution without some sort of plan to address the problem at least. I don't think President Trump's notion of turning it into a resort will happen anytime soon. But on the other hand, the notion of two states, the West Bank here and Gaza here with some sort of umbilical cord connecting them was never very practical. And so you might have a tiny microstate in the West Bank, but that is actually the part of Palestinian territory that Israel wants most because it's most significantly biblical and it has water and Gaza doesn't. I think we really need to end there. Oh, okay.
I'd love to ask him just a more personal question. Because I have never had the pleasure of hearing you speak before. What is driving your passion to continue studying this difficult region and providing public education as you have throughout your whole career? What is that about for you personally?
When I was an undergraduate,
At a famous women's college?
at a famous women's college, I developed a huge crush on the guy that taught Middle Eastern history. He was divine. You know? He padded around the library and without shoes, and he had a scar on his cheek, and he was really good to look at. And I sort of fell in love with the region. And it's a region that most Americans don't spend much time at. And it gets a bad reputation. I've lived there. The people and the culture are wonderful and hospitable, and they get a bad rap in this country. So it's partly Mr. Haddad and partly a more, I don't know, maybe a more ideological idea. Thank you all for coming.